I live in San Luis Potosi in Mexico. This happened to some friends and I about 18 years ago. Back then, I was around 6 years old, but I could remember perfectly. It's hard to forget an experience like this. One day, like any other day, I was playing hide and seek with my friends. It was about 12 kids from my grandmother's neighborhood. I always played and hung out with them, even though I was the smallest of the bunch. We played for 2 hours until some kids started going home. It was already 8 o'clock at night. The weird thing is that one of the older kids' brother was missing. He did not appear, and we thought maybe he was still hiding. We yelled out to him that the game was over and that most of us were leaving. But no matter how much we yelled, the boy did not appear. As time passed, his brother got more and more worried. All of us began looking for him until we heard a scream. "There he is! He's under the tree!" This said tree is used for spiritual cleanses and to ward off entities from inflicted persons. It is also believed that witches use these trees to do spells. This tree was located at the corner of my grandmother's house. It was so leafy and bushy that it seemed like a little house itself. We ran to this infamous tree, and to our surprise, the boy was there. He stood there frozen, with an elf standing right in front of him. It was about 30 centimeters tall. I don't know if anybody saw it any different, but I swear it was just like they show them in the movies, wearing typical Irish clothes like a leprechaun. But this one's skin tone was a bluish white. It practically glowed in the dark. I remember most of us cried. We were so scared of the sight we were beholding. We yelled at the boy by his name, but it seemed like he couldn't hear anything. He simply did not move, nor did the elf. At that moment, his brother frantically called to him. He ran and pulled him by the arm. His brother was finally able to move. He also broke the eye contact he had with that creature. Then he started crying. Still overcome with fear, he told us that he heard everything we were saying to him. He could hear us yelling and calling his name when we were looking for him, but he was helpless, and somehow his voice never came out. He said that inside he was screaming for help and for us to come rescue him, but the elf never let him say or do anything. The elf had him under control by locking eyes with him. The next day, we built up the courage to go back to the same tree where this happened. We noticed that between the trunk and the roots, there was a hole that ran under the tree. We thought for sure the elf came from in there. So we tossed a bunch of stones and debris until the hole was filled up. We never returned to that place since we were children. To be honest with you, I haven't heard of the elf bothering anyone ever again. The following is my story. I've always had an interest in the magic world. Mine was a fascination for all those mystical beings that are talked about so much, like duendes, leprechauns, trolls, gnomes, and elves. My curiosity for these beings was so great that I went on the internet searching for more information about them. During that time, I had a strong disbelief for these creatures, yet I was extremely curious about them, maybe even obsessed, because I went researching online for the purpose of invoking these beings and to be able to see them for myself. So in a nutshell, I wanted to confirm whether they exist or not. On a Thursday night, I came across a website that said they are attracted to plants with purple leaves. I didn't hesitate to get one of these plants, but nothing happened. The days went by like normal. Then I decided to give it a second try. This time, I was going to place a glass of honey and candy at the windows of my house. So I gathered all these things I needed and put them on my window. But just like the time before, I felt like absolutely nothing happened. I was disappointed and almost sure these things didn't exist, but I decided to try just one last time. It was then, to my surprise, I found another mystical website. It stated that through incantation, you can conjure up a gremlin to your house. This incantation was on the same website, and right above it was a cautionary advisory. It warned that these beings, if not treated properly, will cause a lot of mischief, such as hiding objects. In some cases, if you really offend these creatures, they will wreak havoc on those close by. They are notorious for exacting revenge. I was a bit skeptical, so I began reading the incantation out loud. At the end of the invocation, I felt like nothing happened. I went about my day and even forgot about the subject of elves. As soon as night fell, I started feeling uneasy, like I was being watched. I said to myself, it's just my own mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't until bedtime that the strange things started happening. I fell asleep and began having a nightmare in which I saw myself levitating in the kitchen of my house. It was nighttime and I could see someone in front of the refrigerator. When I got close, I could see a man of short stature with the face of an adult, probably about 40 years old. He was bald with a terrifying grin. Within his smile, I could distinguish he had pointy, bad-looking teeth. This creature was staring at me with such hatred. When I backed up, that thing started following me. It was strange, even though it was a dream, I was fully aware of what was happening. I knew I was sleeping, but that moment seemed so real. I got worried this thing was going to hurt me. Each time it kept getting closer and closer to me. It was then I remembered a few verses from the Bible that worked for scaring away all these dark creatures. When I began reciting the Bible scriptures, this thing started laughing right in front of me. I never stopped saying the Lord's name at any moment. After a while, the goblin stopped laughing at me and made an angry sound. I continued to berate him, and at that moment, I woke up. I admit this dream really scared me and left me shook up. It got me thinking about a lot of things. Some days went by, 2 weeks to be exact, after that dream. One night, I got up at midnight to go to the bathroom. All of my family was asleep and everything seemed normal. But when I opened the door, using the same light from the bathroom, I was able to see a small creature that jumped from my brother's bed. Then it rolled and went under the vanity. When it did that, I was able to distinguish its height was about 15 centimeters tall. It was wearing some kind of old clothes with dark colors like brown, forest green, and black. I couldn't see its face, but I'm sure it was a little tiny man. I was so scared, I quickly turned on my bedroom light. I forgot to mention that the bathroom is right next to my room. That's how I was able to see this thing. Having turned on the light gave me the courage to look under the vanity. Despite my fear, I wanted to see what was under there. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. So then I started praying and asking forgiveness for having invoked these creatures. Now I was 100% sure of their existence. On top of that, they are evil entities. After a lot more prayers, nothing else strange happened that night, but I did sleep with the light on. The next day, my parents asked me how come I didn't turn off the light. I told them what I saw the previous night, and they didn't believe me. Even my dad joked and made fun of me, but I'm sure of what I saw. I don't care whether they believed me or not. I just hope that this experience serves you guys a lesson, and to anyone out there who comes across these rituals or invocations, maybe they are dark beings like demons disguised as something else. But one thing is for certain, that they exist and they are not friendly creatures. That I'm sure of. What I'm about to tell you happened to my mother's brothers. Here in Chile, there's a town called Talca, and the houses here have a lot of land. Even though the houses are run down, they usually have a large stretch of pasture for a yard. This was excellent for my uncle, who was a mechanic. He had a lot of space to store his cars and car parts. I should also mention that in this house, not only did my grandfather live here, but also my grandmother and her 6 kids. On one occasion, my grandfather asked my mom to go find some tools among the cars in the yard. It was actually very common for her to bring him his toolbox. She knew perfectly well where it was. At that moment she went, she saw something that shocked her. She saw a colorful hat that moved and disappeared into one of the cars. She didn't think too much of this incident because she thought it could be anything. But just as she was leaving, she heard 2 knocks on the window from one of the cars in the back. She turned around and was petrified when she saw something looking at her with a diabolical smile. She obviously ran as soon as she could react. After 20 years, my mother and uncle still tell stories about their lives. They realize they all saw the same thing. My mother has always described it like the clown on the Joker card, only much more terrifying. Another described it simply like a little person with a malevolent smile. According to my grandmother, who has always seen unusual things and experienced the paranormal, says that it's just a goblin. Today, I can verify that there's things that have really haunted my grandparents' family. Strange things really do happen at their house. Since I also have seen tiny people hiding things too. There's also my 7-year-old cousin. Every time he came over to the house, he screamed and cried that the elves were looking at him. He said that they laughed and made fun of him from outside the yard. I reckon those elves really do exist. My grandmother used to live near a ravine. She had a small house made of wood with a tin roof. I remember she had a yard on the side of her house with a plum tree and a coconut palm tree. My grandma used to tell us stories about gremlins and elves, except she called them chaneques. She used to say that at night you could hear the chaneques in the ravine. You can hear them rustling the bushes and trees, and sometimes they throw rocks. She also told us that ever since our cousin Carlos was a toddler, the chaneques wanted to play with him. One time, they left Carlos asleep in bed, when suddenly he started crying inconsolably. My grandma ran into the room and saw that they were pulling him by his legs. They were trying to take him out through one of the floorboards that was loose near the bed. My grandma rushed to grab Carlos right before he fell. She could see some little black hands let go of him. Ever since that incident with Carlos happened, she used to put his clothes on backwards to drive away the chaneques, and she would not leave him alone. The time passed like this until my cousin grew up. Carlos was 5 years old when he told my grandmother that some children called him to go play in the ravine with them. The way he described them, he said they were little, black, and naked. My grandma ordered Carlos to ignore them because they were calling him to take him away. She reminded him to always put his shirt on backwards. One afternoon, my cousin went outside to play while my grandma did her house chores. After a while, my grandmother realized Carlos wasn't in the house nor in the yard. So she started screaming out his name, but nothing. Now she called Carlos's older brothers and his uncle to go look for him. Back then, their surroundings were in and around the mountain. They searched for him in different places around the mountain, but they couldn't find him. Since it was almost nighttime, it was going to be more difficult to find Carlos. My uncle went a little further and climbed up a hill, when suddenly he heard a cry. Determined, he immediately ran towards the sound, and that's how he found my cousin, tied to a tree. As he untied him, Carlos, through tears, said this to my uncle. "It was the little black children that brought me all the way over here. I was playing with them, and when I wanted to go back, they didn't let me, so they tied me up to this tree." After this incident, my grandma told him he should always obey her. Otherwise, the Chaneques were going to take him, and we would never see him again. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me in Oaxaca, Mexico, in a town called La Joya. This town is not very big. When I was 12 years old, a man from another village came to live here. He bought his land very close to my parents' house. The new neighbors were good people and got along well with my parents. The neighbor was an avid farmer, but he did not have enough land to sow. He wanted to plant corn and beans to harvest later. So then my dad told him he would lend him a piece of land. They agreed, and so the neighbor began to farm that hillside. This field that my father lent him is right at the foot of the hill. The days went by, and the man went every morning at 8 a.m. to the cornfield. He gathered his tools to later return between 3 or 4 p.m. to pick them up. One day about 6 p.m., the man had not returned from the field. His wife was concerned, so she came over to ask my father if he knew where he was. My dad told her that maybe he got caught up talking to someone and that she should not worry. So the lady calmed down and went back to her home. By then it got even later, 8 p.m., and her husband still was not back yet. By now my father was also worried. He rounded up between 8 and 10 neighbors, and they all went looking for the man, since the field was so big. After 3 hours of searching, they finally found the man. They were shocked when they saw what happened to him. The man was stuck in the hole of a well, upside down, and they could only see his feet. They got him out of there, just in time because he was almost dead. My mother says that the man had turned purple from all the blood that went to his head. He had been in that position for far too long. When the man recovered, he told them what really happened. And he said, "It was them. It was those little ones who pulled these devilish pranks on me. They wanted to play with me. Suddenly I felt a tug until they yanked me off my feet. Next thing I knew, they dragged me across the entire field. When they got bored, they dragged me over to the well, the same one they came out of. I felt a bunch of little hands carrying me around while they laughed and screamed. I saw them. They were short and they lived in that hole." The man went on, still very much distraught. He added, "This territory is theirs and it belongs to them. That's why they did this to me. They do not want to be disturbed in their home." Our neighbor told us this version of the story, who, by the way, is still injured from the waist down because of this incident. Since then, I've passed by there, and I always get that feeling that something is watching me. To this day, that infamous hole is still there in the same place, and I make damn sure not to go nowhere near it. I'm from Mexico, and what I'm about to tell you is something that happened to me when I was 11 years old. At that time is when the first Xbox had just come out, and my dad bought me one. He brought it home on Saturday. The following Sunday, he was craving a pizza, so they went to go pick it up. My parents told me to go with them, but like a kid with a new toy, I did not want to go. I was having way too much fun with the Xbox, so I stayed home. Then it got between 9 or 10 o'clock, and my parents were not back yet. I was still very entertained playing when suddenly I heard a noise under the bed, as if something was kicked against the wall. I paused my game and got up. I went over and I knocked on the wall. The noise stopped, so I continued with my game until I heard it again, but this time much louder. At the same time, a ball shot out with such force it rolled and hit the wall. Just a few minutes later, I saw a creature run out from under the bed. It looked like a rat, except this one moved on two legs. I froze right there, just looking in the direction where it had gone, watching and waiting for it to come out from under the door. Suddenly, it came back and looked at me with a really wicked laugh. Then it ran off again. Within half an hour, my parents came back. I was crying when I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me at all. Later that night, we ended up drinking some coffee that my mother was craving. She ripped open a pack of cookies, and two of them fell on the floor. One of them broke in three pieces, and the other broke in half. My mother was going to pick them up to throw them away, but she only found one piece of cookie. No doubt that was too much for her not to believe me now. Before we went to sleep, we put a plate of sugar, a couple of cookies, and some flour on a plate. We placed all this under the bed, and the next morning we checked it, only to find a pair of hoof prints in the flour. The cookies and the sugar were gone. I am currently 20 years old, and nothing else like this has happened to me. But my little niece said that sometimes she saw tiny doll-sized people in the house. Without a doubt, I'm sure what she saw were elves. When I was a little boy, my sisters used to complain that things always disappeared from the house. My grandmother said it was probably elves, because these items would turn up 1 or 2 weeks later. The only people that believed us were my mom and my aunt, because they're the only ones who believed in the paranormal. There was one day, like any other day, my brother left the house at 6 in the morning headed towards his high school. On his path, he came across a field with a lot of trees. That time of the morning was still dark and only lit by a nearby house. On one occasion, he was walking the same way until he realized there was something moving in the field. So he grabbed a rock and threw it toward the field. When it landed, he said, "Frickin' dog!" Right after he said that, he froze in his tracks. He saw a naked elf staring back at him for a few seconds. After being discovered, the elf ran towards a bridge. Although my brother wanted to go after him, his legs felt heavy. He ran out of breath and couldn't keep up with him anymore. A few days later, he began to convulse in the house for no apparent reason. During those days, out of nowhere, my sister began hearing music in the house. We heard her scream and ran to help her. She said she saw an elf in the house. After this incident, my brother's convulsions went away just like that. But my sister and him said they kept on seeing the elf throughout the whole house. It wasn't just my siblings either. My in-laws were also frightened by these beings. They were terrorized to such a degree that the elves jumped up on their beds. They constantly made fun of my in-laws. They laughed and sneered their teeth at them. Doggone those elves. They sure are mischievous. I have a story about gremlins that I want to tell you. One night, we had a power outage in my city. I was with my son Derek, who at the time was 4 years old. My mother was also there, along with my sister and my 3 nephews. The little ones were bored without TV, so the children decided to play hide and seek in the house. When they hid, One of them, named Luisito, was the first to seek. He started looking around, and the first to be found was my son Derek. After that, he started looking for Stephen. At that moment, I clearly saw how a little person crept out of my niece's room. It passed by hunched over as if not to make any noise. I told Luisito, "Hey, there goes your cousin." But I was shocked when I saw Stephen come out of somewhere else saying, "But Auntie, I'm right here." At that moment, I decided they should stop playing because I was getting too creeped out, and they just might find one of those little creatures. This story that I want to tell you, it happened to my mom back in 2016 when she worked at an elementary school. One Friday, she came home from work terrified. She was so shaken that I had to fetch her some water while she calmed down, just for her to tell me what happened. When she finally calmed down, she told me that at the school where she works, a group of students saw some real elves. Instead of leaving them alone, the kids started provoking the goblins, and for that, they suffered the consequences for their actions. It turns out, earlier that day, the teachers were in a meeting while the students were at recess. Out of nowhere, the teachers began to feel pebbles being thrown from above the ceiling. They didn't pay too much mind because they figured it was some students misbehaving by taking rocks and throwing them through the windows. Strangely enough, they began to hear some kids screaming from the schoolyard. The teachers then quickly ran outside to see what was the matter. There they found one of the girls named Andrea. She supposedly confronted one of the elves. Andrea was now sitting on the ground next to a tree, hysterical. The children said that she was staring at the tree, and suddenly she was transfixed. Andrea said she heard her father calling her. She was acting really strange, so her schoolmates took her by the hands. Somehow she broke loose from their grip, so she ran back towards the tree, but luckily they caught up to her, and this time they held on to her tightly. According to the children, they saw 3 small creatures. One of them was jumping from the tree to the roof of the teacher's classroom. Another one was weaving something, and the other, who was apparently the leader, was talking to Andrea. My mother says that the poor girl began foaming at the mouth, so they called a local witch to come heal and cleanse her. All of the kids that were with Andrea inexplicably suffered a strong fever within the hour, so the teachers ended up taking all of the children to their homes. Andrea was the most affected by all this. My mother told me later that sometimes Andrea wakes up with her hair braided, or worse yet, with horse crap or cow turd smeared all over her face. Apparently, she really did make these goblins very angry. When I was younger, I lived in the state of Tabasco, Mexico. In this small town, the most common way to earn a living was to raise livestock. A long time ago, I stayed with my grandpa at his ranch, while my father attended his work in the nearby town. One day that we were out ranching, it got real late on us. We were tired, so we decided to sleep under the palapa near the stables. I got in one of those hammocks there and fell asleep right away. Soon after, I could hear people talking in the distance. I thought it was the workers that were just arriving. So I tried going back to sleep, but I kept hearing how violently the tree branches were moving. My grandpa was sound asleep, since he was older and the years weighed more heavy on him. But meanwhile, you can hear the horses being disturbed. Hearing all this frightened me, so I pretended that I was asleep. No more than 5 minutes passed when I heard footsteps coming closer to me. I closed my eyes tight while trying to find a logical explanation for everything that was happening. Then I felt something rub me from underneath. It brushed under the hammock with me in it, and suddenly I tumbled out of the hammock. I was on the ground when something pulled my hair. Despite all my fear, I yelled, "Get the hell out of here, or I'm gonna lynch you!" My grandpa woke up from my screaming. He asked me, "What's happening?" I held back and told him it was only a bad dream, because when I looked around, there was nothing there. I didn't want him to call me crazy. The next day, when we were getting ready for work, we decided to saddle the horses. While we got dressed, I started telling my grandpa what really happened. He told me that it was probably nothing. After that, I noticed that he was deep in thought. We went to get the horses, and we saw that their tails and manes were braided. Grandpa told me that it had to be some elves up to their mischief, and we had to teach them a lesson. After we finished work, we had a couple drinks to relax our nerves and to awaken us from the day's occurrence. Once my grandpa was a little buzzed, he told me that he had to gather some things from the work shed and that I should accompany him, or else those gremlins were going to keep up their antics, but each time more brazen. He added that I was at risk too, because they might hurt me. So among his tools, he took out an old deck of cards and some makeup that used to belong to my grandma, who died some time ago. When night began to fall, my grandpa locked almost all the doors. He also sprinkled lime on every windowsill. Then he took out a bottle of tequila from his reserve stash and a hand mirror from the dresser next to his bed. He placed all these items on a small table in the middle of the living room, and finally a full-size mirror a couple of meters from the table. Then we put on our shirts, our pants, our boots, and our hats. When we were about to leave the house, Grandpa turned to me in a serious voice. He said, "Put on that belt that I gave you, and bring that riding whip that you made." That seemed strange to me since I only used that stick to whip the horse. I had a leather belt with a nice buckle that Grandpa bought me on a trip to Chiapas. He also told me to leave the front door open. Then we left to go get the horses. We were out horseback riding for a good 40 minutes. I finally asked Grandpa, "What are we doing?" He told me that they had to see that we're not at home. I didn't know what to think anymore. So then we went back towards the house again. As we got closer, I thought I heard laughter coming from inside. Then we put the horses back in the stables and Grandpa said, "It's time." He asked me for the belt and I handed it over to him quickly. He told me to take out my riding stick and I did so. As we walked back to the house, it sounded like a disaster in there. Before we reached the front door, Grandpa turned to me and said, "Don't be scared. You will learn that nobody messes with our family." My throat closed up and I didn't know what to expect. He entered the house, and when he turned on the light, everything went silent. I believe the house was empty but turned completely upside down. When I looked at the mirror, I clearly saw the reflection of 6 or 7 tiny people. My grandfather started swinging that belt and you could hear it whipping through the air, and he told me to do the same. I got my stick and started swinging for the fences. I felt like I hit something that I couldn't see in front of me, but I could see it through the mirror. After that, you can hear them retreating to the windows and grabbing the window panes trying to get out through there. But they screamed every time they touched the lime. A cry was heard amongst little screams again and again saying, "No more! No more, please!" My grandfather told me to get away from the door. I felt something brush my leg and step on my boot. Right then, my grandpa took a chair from the house and set it outside. He took a big swig of tequila and said, "I can't stand those little screams." I asked, "What screams are you talking about?" He said, "Stop thinking so much and just listen." It was then I could hear all the screams and cries coming from the mountain. We stayed there talking, and while we drank tequila, I asked him, "Grandpa, what the hell just happened?" "Those things we just kicked out of the house are elves. For years they've been pulling their mischief on the youngest members of our family. Your father never wanted to hear that subject, but now it was your turn. They like to have fun pulling their lewd pranks. It's been several times that they've tangled the horse's hair, to the point where we have to cut their tails because there's no way we could untangle them. They also mess with my work tools and move them from their place, not to mention that they scare the cattle. If we don't put a stop to them, they'll keep on pulling their pranks, each time worse until they hurt somebody. It's a good thing my own grandfather also taught me how to stop them. Since they're quite vain, they use your grandma's makeup to primp themselves. They also like tequila, so much that on one occasion they got drunk and let themselves be seen in plain sight. The deck of cards is for entertaining them. That way they're distracted and they don't see you coming. And if they don't let you see them, you'll be able to see the reflection in the mirror. Their skin is different from ours, so the line really hurts them. And that's how my weekend with my grandfather went. Ever since then, he was more open with me about these type of phenomena. He continued teaching me the same way about the ranch and the creatures that live on the hillside. Although many of those creatures are innocent, there's also some that are out to cause harm, like in the case of the Nahuales, the skinwalkers, and the witches. And these are the things that I learned from my grandpa.